We'll begin with prayer. I'm going to use specifically the Kontakion and Troparion, which are for feast days of spiritual mothers. And so it's written in the singular because it is the same applied then to any of the spiritual mothers that we'll speak about tonight. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. You offered your life as a holy gift, O righteous one, for resplendent with the light of repentance, you illumined humankind. Now pray to Christ, who has magnified you, to grant us his great mercy. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. The image of God was truly preserved in you, O Holy Mother, for you took up the cross and followed Christ. By so doing, you taught us to disregard the flesh, for it passes away, but to care instead for the soul, since it is immortal. Therefore, your spirit, O Venerable Mother, rejoices with the angels, now and ever and forever. Amen. You depleted your bodily strength by fasting, vigils, and prayers, entreating the Creator to grant forgiveness of your sin. Having received it, you showed us the way of repentance, O Venerable Mother. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. It's a rather recent development. Recent for all the wrong reasons. It is considered a recent topic because of different movements within the Catholic Church and within also other denominations, that movements that have attempted to authenticate and historically show the role of women in the church. And so it seems it's sometimes turned into a little bit of a polemical issue where these are very ancient lives of holy women who are, for the most part, the ones that are remembered are canonized. They are saints in some in different churches, so Roman Catholic as well as Orthodox, as well as like Coptic Orthodox. And then some are canonized by their own church. So for example, many of the mothers of the desert who lived in Egypt are canonized by the Egyptian church, which is the Coptic Orthodox Church. And of course, there are some that are canonized within the Byzantine Orthodox Church, like the Greek Church, and some that are canonized only in the Roman Catholic Church. And so they belong, in a sense, to different churches. Some are universally recognized, others are not. But one of the big themes and issues, I think, that has come up with the study of their lives, the translation of their lives, is this big question mark. Why are we just hearing about these women recently, where fathers of the church have had their writings translated into different languages and copied in manuscript form even, from the Middle Ages on? Why does it seem that the lives of the holy women weren't also being copied and shared and then published and printed? And so the polemical end of things, those who want to read into why this happened, so they see it as a male-dominated church has suppressed the lives of these holy women, And, so it becomes a little bit of a kind of a feminist type of an issue. I don't know what the truth is. I mean, possibly there is some truth in it, but as far as it's difficult to go into absolutes and say, well, this is why it happened. I think the important thing to recognize that even though in the Western Church, this has been a recent rediscovery, especially by, different contemporary authors, who have written books like this one, The Witness of Early Christian Women. And there are many, many other books out there that speak to this subject. In the Eastern churches, more dominantly in the churches that are not in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, to a lesser degree in the Eastern Catholic churches, these women have always figured prominently in the life of the church. There hasn't been, they haven't dominated it, with one exception, and that would be Saint Mary of Egypt. She is, I would say, she kind of blasts a lot of male saints right out of the water. She has her own Sunday that is dedicated to her in all of the Byzantine Orthodox and Catholic churches. So the presence of this group of women that is referred to as desert mothers, they have always been present, and but in some different ways. And it's of course very nice that today we can share a little bit about them as part of the Universal Church's heritage of faith. And so in order to not become overly structured and talk about, like when we talk about the fathers of the church, which is a kind of a big group with different theological currents and leanings, that can become a little bit stale because you don't have the all of the story of the individuals when you look at groups. And I think one of the benefits of this particular group of women is that we have an opportunity to befriend them. That through their study of their life, their works, and of course, recognizing their sainthood, they become for us friends on the journey. And so we can apply some of the realities that they lived and suffered through and experienced, as well as some of their wisdom in a different way than, perhaps we do with the fathers of the church, who are a broad group that have different roles. This group is a little more, I would say, limited in their scope. And of course, they don't have the same bearing on the history of theology and the councils and things like that. However, their influence and impact should not be taken lightly, because they do have also a great and important role in church history in a different way. So I think firstly, I'd like to begin with just a little bit of an analysis of how, generically speaking, women were treated, or also some of the misrepresentation of how they were treated in New Testament times. Specifically, when we go to St. Paul, in St. Paul, we deal with a couple of specific writings where he gives directives which very often are thrown around as reasons, for, why women shouldn't do things and shouldn't be doing things in the church and need to be, their hair needs to be covered. And so it's some of that it's a misrepresentation of what Paul was actually dealing with and doing. So firstly, I will go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 34 and 35. This is one that is very often quoted as a source for some of these issues. As in all the churches of the holy ones, women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not allowed to speak, but should be subordinate, as even the law says. But if they want to learn anything, they should ask their husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in the church. So that's a whopper. And this is the one that is very popularly quoted. So when you get, and I've seen this on both the Eastern end as well as the Western end. So it's like there is all versions and varieties of Christianity have used this to their own benefit or detriment. And so the first thing that we need to do is put it into context. So the church of Corinth that Paul was writing to was a church that he founded around the year 51. And it was a small church in a very important ancient town. The town had also a significant Jewish population, as well as different shrines to Greek gods and goddesses. And religion was very much a part of the society. Paul begins this small group where everybody knows each other. It's an intimate group of Christians, some who come from a Gentile background and some who come from a Jewish background. When Paul leaves, so they come into some problems. They have some leadership issues, and as they say, familiarity breeds contempt. Well, it really did a job on this community. So they ended up being subdivided into many subgroups, and issues of order and authority, as well as scandals. Because some of the people, even though they were Christians technically, they still, out of some sense perhaps of obligation or peer pressure, participated in some of the pagan rituals, like offering food to idols. And within the community, there was also the accusation that one of its members was married to a close relative, and that was so an incestuous relationship, we would say. And so these things were all part of kind of the gossip of the community, and it tore the community apart. So much so that different people within the community try to assert leadership of the community, including women. Because sometimes when men mess things up, it takes a woman to clean it up. And that's a fact. And so this was happening there in the midst of this little community in a big ancient city. And so Paul is writing 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Doctrinally, he's making his point, but he's also chastising and encouraging them to set up some structure and some order. And so some of his words may be a little heavy-handed, but there's also a part of the story that we don't know. So we don't know exactly what was going on that would lead to some of his reactions. Now, so Paul gets this reputation because of this, and many theologians even have gone after him because of his perceived issues with women. And of course, it adds up when you say, okay, well, he wasn't a married man, so he didn't have that empathy that he needed. So there are justifications to it, but one needs only look in some of his other letters to see also that there is a different side to it. And so when we turn to Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 16, beginning with verse 1, he says this, which seems to very starkly contrast to what he said in Corinthians. I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is also a deacon of the church at St. Chrysostom, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the holy ones, and help her in whatever she may need from you. For she has been a benefactor to many, and to me as well. And so, some of the translations will say that they'll say a minister, or they translate, but the Greek word is the same word that we use for deacons. It actually gives us the word deacons. And so, because it is also used to describe others who are ordained deacons, we pretty much can surmise that she was a deaconess, which did exist in the early church as an ordination and a practice. And her ministry would be specifically with women and children in the early Christian community. But here, he's not even stating that her ministry is to be somehow limited to a group. She is actually being sent. And the deacons did wield a certain amount of authority, especially when it came to the charity and the social works of the Christian community. And so we see we have to kind of balance this reality out, that Paul, he's addressing communities with their different needs. And so the early church did not have, some sort of an issue that is based on Pauline, Paul's vision of the church. Rather, they are very clearly, the church very clearly has always had an intimate place for women within the church, beginning with the person of Mary, of the Mother of God. And the early church, we have this group of women who are given the title of the myrrh bearers. They are the first witnesses of the resurrection. And they even bring the message of Jesus' resurrection to the apostles. So there is a definite role for women in the life of the church from the very beginning, from the time of Jesus. So then we have to move a little bit away then from that period of time to the desert mothers. The desert is, in Greek, the word for desert is eremos. And we get the word hermit from that. Eremos, literally translated, means place of abandonment. And so it is literally the personification of isolation, loneliness, abandonment. And so the desert in the early church, but even within the gospel tradition and within the Old Testament, the prophets, was a place where one would come face to face with loneliness, solitude, and death. It was a dangerous place. People didn't go, like nowadays you can take a vacation in the desert, and get charged a lot of money to live in a camper somewhere in Arizona and take in the desert, since it has whatever rejuvenating qualities as you sweat your life away. 2,000 years ago in the Old Testament, it wasn't exactly that pleasant. It was the place of lawlessness. That's where all the thieves and robbers and people who jumped, people who were traveling, that's where they lived, where they hid their booty in the caves. That's where people would get bitten by poisonous snakes and scorpions. And that's where one would go to die. I mean, basically, if one lost the will to live, going to the desert was a way of leading to one's own death and demise. And so the desert is not this friendly place, but the prophets go there because it is in their loneliness and isolation that they can peel away the layers of their life, of their commitments, of their attachments. They can peel that away and become more focused on God, realize the necessity that they have for God, for their life and livelihood. And so the prophets go there, and Jesus goes there. He went into the desert for 40 days because it was also this place of prayer. The solitude that is there, the isolation, naturally lends itself, when one is well disposed, lends itself to an intimate connection with God and an intimate encounter with God. The desert strips one down to that which is essential, because no longer titles, clothing, all the tools that one could have, none of that matters. When you are in the desert, you become completely dependent on God. That's the only way that one can survive. And also, it is a place where one can check his or her own mortality, because that is a place where, you hear about people who have close to death encounters, or, who have died and been brought back. Well, the desert for the prophets, for the New Testament, for John the Baptist, for the desert fathers and mothers, was this place where one could come face to face with death, with one's mortality. And so the desert mothers and the desert fathers, because this happens at the same time in church history, both men and women go to the desert beginning in the 3rd century. And they go there to find themselves, to find their authentic self, and to shed all those layers which society has placed upon them, their families have placed upon them, etc., etc. They can get rid of the clutter and all of the trappings that cover up who they really are. For the desert fathers and mothers, going to the desert means focusing their life and attention on cultivating the soul, or soul making. So instead of in the world, one makes a career, one makes a family, one makes a life with a spouse, one creates relationships socially, politically. There, instead of making any of those aspects of human life, it becomes entirely focused on the soul, on the spiritual life. And that's a unique part of the experience of the desert. Now, I'd like to introduce to you a few different figures. All, as I said, are canonized, and they come from a reality which is, I guess, different from what we're familiar with. Most of these women began their lives at a time when Christianity was coming out of the catacombs. And so beginning at the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th century. Monasticism was not really well organized. However, the desire for a life that would be the life of a hermit or an ascetic or a monastic, and monastic, we can use that word, even though today when we say monastic, so we're thinking people who live in a monastery, and monastery means community. After all, monastery is a group of people sharing a common life and mission. But monastic comes from the Greek word monos, which means alone. And so its inception, its beginning was not that of a community life, but rather a heremitic life, the life of one living alone and isolated. And so after the legalization of Christianity in the year 313 by Constantine, the church, the period of martyrs, comes to an end. And even though there will be more martyrs, but the persecution that happened under especially the Romans, those persecutions which gave us long lists of martyrs, literally thousands and thousands of people who were martyred in the vast Roman Empire, from Spain all the way to the Middle East, to North Africa. These martyrs are in a group unto themselves, this era of the martyrs. Because these were the superheroes of the faith, they were buried under churches or in catacombs, and early Christians wanted to be buried close to them. So all of a sudden, the end of that age of martyrs meant that within the church, there was this group of people that were no longer bearing witness to the faith. Christianity was becoming comfortable. After all, Constantine's mother, Helena, was a Christian. And where she went and found Christian sites in the Holy Land, she dropped a lot of money and built churches. Constantine himself was supporting also churches, and he built the first cathedral in Rome, as well as the first St. Peter's Basilica. And so many people were coming to Christian faith now out of a sense of curiosity. They may have admired Christians and their witness, but the martyrs were no longer a reality. They were there, but part of the history now of the church. And so monasticism, going into the desert, was the response. This was a group of men and women who decided to die to their lives, to their realities, to their riches, to their comfort, to their position, to their education, They left all that behind, and they, in a sense, died to the world, and they began to live under extreme circumstances in isolation in the desert. And so it was a new martyrdom in a sense. Now, none of these were seeking, death. That was not the goal in this. Martyr's death. They did not have a death wish by living in the desert, but rather they wished to go through that process of purification, peeling away all those other layers so that they could be raw in the presence of God. And so we hear, there are a number of different witnesses to the desert mothers. And one of the questions is, if there are these historical references, why have they not been shared with Christians throughout these centuries? The stories of the desert mothers have been shared with Christians throughout the last 1700 years. However, it's a very specific group of Christians, and that group are nuns. And so the stories of the desert women are preserved in writings that were meant to be read in convents and monasteries of women. So it wasn't necessarily something that was for public reading. However, there are writings that do speak about some of these different women, and very interestingly, one of the most important sources for the stories of a number of desert mothers is Saint Jerome. So Saint Jerome, who is known as the man who translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, giving us the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible, who himself was an interesting personality. He had a reputation of being a little bit of a curmudgeon. He would be someone that was, I guess you could say, socially awkward in today's wording. He didn't particularly care for human company, so a little, unique. However, when he came to Rome, he discovered a reality happening in the Church of Rome. And this is, we're talking about the mid-4th century. So 350 and 360, in that period. He comes to Rome and he discovers that there are women who are affluent, who have means, who are living in their homes and mansions and maintaining the exterior of the mansion, and yet inside there's no furniture. Inside there is no bed. And so he became intrigued that this was something different. And he befriended some of these ladies and came to participate in their life. So what was the reality for early Christian women in the city of Rome? The city of Rome, we know from the time of Constantine and even past, so even during the Christianization of the city of Rome, it was a city that had different societal levels, and some families had a political background, and so they were, from the beginning of the city of Rome, they were part of the the Senate, and they had produced many leaders and many gifted legislators, and the city, even though it became Christian, it still maintained its ancient Roman heritage. And so we find this group of women who, very much according to the experience of the early church, were very proactive supporters of Christianity. And many of them had come to the faith through difficulties in their own life. Many were converts, and so they came to know Christianity within that Christianizing Roman Empire, with Constantine as its emperor. And he found this reality to be kind of different, and yet there is some history for it. And so bouncing back, so leaving the 4th century, we can bounce back to the 3rd century when Christianity was persecuted. And we find that in the city of Rome, there is a group of women. Roman law did not particularly favor women per se. However, as with anything that is legal, there are always loopholes. And so a number of these secret Christian women found ways of being Christian and supporting Christianity, and still living free, living emancipated. And so a woman could become emancipated or independent in 3 different ways, according to Roman law in the 3rd century. She could be widowed or divorced, if the divorce is initiated by her husband. So that's one way of becoming emancipated, meaning that she also has her own money. She has her own means, she has her own name. A second way where a woman could become independent or emancipated, and this is a little more dramatic, she could, kick her husband out of her house, but she had to have 3 children. Preferably one of those kids would be also a male, so that there would be an heir. And so if she had an heir that she was raising and taking care of, then she could get rid of her husband. Easy enough to prove that he was, deadbeat, cheater, who knows what. And then the third way, and this is the weirdest way, the third way that she could be emancipated is to register herself legally as a prostitute. Prostitutes in ancient Rome had legal status. If they were well-to-do, a woman could choose to do that, even if she was coming from a family that had means. And so this way she controlled her own finances. So this is still under full persecution of the Roman government. Different independent women who use these 3 ways to have their own finances, they became Christian and sponsored domestic churches. And the ones, and as far as like registration as a prostitute, there wasn't exactly, it wasn't like the Roman government was going to come and make sure that she was actually working her trade. They would get this declaration. It would be a public declaration. So obviously people would also look down on her. But the ones who went that route, normally took a vow of chastity or virginity. And then they had their own inheritance or dowry, whatever they had from their family. And so these were the women in the city of Rome in the 3rd century who supported the apostles, who supported the prophets, who supported the priests, who supported the bishops. And when you go to Rome, you can actually see the names of many of these women preserved on different historical sites. And many of these women have also been canonized. You know, part of it, I'm sure, so when we jump forward 100 years and we get to this period where women are doing similar things, we shouldn't be surprised. I think the culture of ancient Rome, it may not have been favorable to women. However, the strength of women who were Roman aristocracy, who were educated, their strength, their integrity, their drive led them to find ways to be Christian, to support the church, and really to build the church. The church in Rome is built on their legacy. So you might be saying, well, that's an interesting thing. So how do we know that all of this is true? Because after all, in early Christian history, there's a lot of nebulous stuff. There's a lot of fog when it comes to different things. And, you know, like we don't know even how exactly Christians gathered, or how did they get the word out, you know, that there was a secret domestic church somewhere. Well, we know this because Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, ordered specifically attacks on chaste Christian women. And his attacks, and Diocletian was very ruthless, but he ordered that since they lived isolated in their own homes, he ordered that not only his soldiers, but basically anyone, any man should go and rape women or force them into prostitution. They could be arrested and then sold into prostitution. Because Diocletian, I think, realized what was going on. He realized that someone had made use of this loophole. And we also know that Diocletian indirectly ordered the martyrdom of 1,000 chaste women living like this in and around Antioch, and the martyrdom of 2,000 women also living as chaste women in the city of Ansara. And so that's how we know that, and by the numbers, we know that this must have been a phenomenon that was in wide use. Now, the reaction to this was that at the end of the 3rd century, the church, still underground, became less dependent on these women because it was much more dangerous. I think that women who were leading a life like this were basically forced into the underground because the persecution was very demeaning and destructive and intentional. And so this generation of women who were monastic in a unique way, this generation unfortunately did not survive. However, in the church, it was revived. And this is what Jerome comes into contact with. And so Jerome comes into contact with women living in specifically the Aventine neighborhood of Rome, which is one of the hills of Rome. And it is an area of many ancient families, well-to-do. And there is a widow named Marcella. And Marcella is the leader of this group of women who are all living on their own. However, they have a network of support. They come together. This is already, Christianity is free, so they can gather and pray. And they gather together with each other to support each other, to pray together. However, then they return to their homes for their own private prayer and for their own life. They gave up all of the trappings that are interior to their house, and they lived completely differently from their neighbors. However, they did not want the neighbors to know that they were living that kind of a life. They no longer participated in high society gatherings. They didn't wear the silk robes of the Romans or the perfumes or have the fancy hairstyles. They even gave up what was a Roman luxury of bathing. And but they stayed in their homes where they prayed and fasted, where they studied scripture. Jerome became intimate to these women because he led them in the study of scripture. He was invited as kind of a spiritual guide for their own growth. They visited the tombs of the martyrs and the saints and the catacombs. They slept on mats on their hard floors, not in beds. And those who were widows did not remarry, despite very often pressure from their own families. And those who were not married, they opted for a life of virginity and chastity. This group of women, we're not sure how many there were in this group of women. They lived, in a sense, a community life like hermitesses, but still within the world. So it was from this group led by Marcella, and Marcella is canonized. She used her entire wealth and property in support of the church and specifically in good works. So she was not necessarily contributing to the building fund of one of the basilicas in Rome, but she was working with those who were poor. And one of the biggest groups in ancient Roman society that was afflicted by poverty were widows and children. Those widows who were of means, so of course they kept their own life because they continued to work in the businesses of their family. They had means to support their lifestyle. But the majority of people were not rich. And there was no social network to fall back on that would assist them as widows and orphans. And very often, widows would end up in prostitution. Very often, children would be sold into slavery. And very often, children would also become a part of prostitution too. And so many of the societal evils of ancient Rome, really they found a continuous source of people to feed those evils. And so Marcella was one of these women who attempted in her own way to make a difference with the people that she could affect. And this was something that Jerome commended and recognized, and something that he wrote about also. One of the issues, though, in Rome, and this we'll see especially in the lives of some of the other women, one of the issues with Rome, as I mentioned before, even though Roman society was Christianizing, it was not becoming like some utopia that was now, without the different societal classes. It still maintained its old Roman structure. And, we see this specifically by Constantine, because Constantine becomes a Christian in name only. He didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed. But he begins to support all these different things. His mother is the one who is building a lot of the different sites in the Holy Land. And Roman political society reacts to his favor for Christianity very negatively, very aggressively. And so, Mediterranean society in that time, but even up to today, is extremely gossipy. And so one of the things that was talked about in Constantine's time was that his mother was not actually married to his father, which she was, but he divorced her because she wasn't a match as far as the classes are concerned. And so they said that Constantine's father found her in a brothel. And so they insinuated she was a prostitute, and hence Constantine was illegitimate. And that upset Helena so much that she moved to Germany. I mean, that's how you get away from the Romans. And Constantine saw that there was so much drama going on around him. His own wife turned on him. And, and the Romans, they tried to instigate problems within his family life. So, for example, he got wind that his son, who was Helena's favorite grandchild, that his son was trying to overthrow him. And so he, this is before he became baptized, so he was not yet a fully Christian. So he had his own son killed. And then it came out that it was a lie, because the Romans were trying to mess with him. And so these ancient families that were pagan leaning, that had a very comfortable existence in the previous Rome, they wanted to get rid of him. And so Constantine decides to move the capital, or better said, he builds another capital and makes it a co-capital. And so he goes and in 324 establishes the city of Constantinople. And he names it after himself because he's such a modest man. But he did that, no doubt, in reaction to some of this heavy-handed gossip that led to tragedies in his family. He was really, he really found that upper crust, ancient Roman stuff too much to deal with. And so he's dealing with it. So of course it's also impacting some of the women who are part of this group. And it begins an exodus. The women hear that in Egypt there is a desert, which is enormous, and many Roman women from the city of Alexandria have decided to go to the desert. And they have found in the desert a spiritual life that was full and fulfilling. And so, and Alexandria was an affluent city. It was, if you could say, if Rome was the capital, so Rome was like the Washington, D.C., then Alexandria was New York. And it was this melting pot of cultures that connected that which was familiar of Rome to the ancient Greek culture, because of course, it's based on Alexander the Great's heritage. And then you've got this wonderful mix of African cultures that all trade through the city of Alexandria, and even cultures from the Arabian Peninsula and far off India could get to Alexandria. And so it was a place which was on the radar of any Roman family that was well-to-do. And so many packed up all their belongings, sold what they had, and moved to Egypt. And then when they got to Egypt, they connected with the women who were living in the desert. They connected with the monastics too, the men who were living in the desert, to find a home, to find a place where they could live, where they could discover and deepen their relationship with God. And so one of these women, who is known to us as Saint Melania the Elder, she was born in the year 340 in Roman Spain, and was from a very prominent aristocratic family. She was the daughter of one of the military leaders of the Roman Empire at that time, under Constantine. And he was, we'd be talking about like a 4-star general. So he was very famous within the Roman Empire. She was married into another family that was equally affluent. At the time when she was married, and she would have been about 18 when she got married. So she hit her 20s, and she was known as one of the richest women in the Roman Empire. And so Melania was still pagan. We don't know if she was entertaining thoughts of Christianity, but probably being from an aristocratic family, she should be well educated, cultured. She probably talked to servants that she had who were Christian, so she definitely had some insight into Christianity. And then at the age of 22, her husband and 2 of her 3 sons become ill and die. And basically, her world ends. And out of depression, out of sadness, she connects with Marcella. And Marcella introduces her to Christianity. She introduces her to this group of women. And so she spends a number of years learning from Marcella and becoming Christian, and then deciding to make vows of chastity. And so she converts out of, you could say, personal despair, but through Marcella, she comes to true faith. And however, as a woman who is in her mid-20s, so she can still have children, she is loaded. And so there are many families who are trying to marry her, to get their sons married to her, because she is affluent and with a great name, and they can still have children. And so Melania feels the pressure. And so she decides to sell everything and move to Egypt. And so she does this to avoid being ordered to remarry, because that's the other part of the problem. Since she is from a family that is really the top of the pyramid, so similarly to, like royal families, the marriage can be arranged by other people who would have control of her life. And since she saw that that was coming, that was one of the things that she needed to avoid. And so she moved to Egypt to avoid being remarried against her will. She moved to Egypt because she was seeking monastics. She knew that in Egypt, and this is the figure that was written in a book, which would have been a manuscript by a man named Palladius. She knew that in Egypt, in the Egyptian desert alone, he estimated that there were close to 3,000 men and women living as monastics. And so she went there to be with this community, to study with them, to learn from them. And of course, since she took a vow of chastity in Rome under Marcella, she wanted to continue her own spiritual journey and religious life. The interesting thing, though, she liquidated her assets, kept some properties. She still had one son that survived, so he would have inherited everything anyways. So she set him up. So he had his, what we would say like a trust fund. And so he was set up. And because of the way that Roman families function, the concept of extended family was also very strong. And so she entrusted her son to one of her family members who took care of him and raised him. She did not bring him to Egypt with her. And Melania, for that, was maligned by her own family. They called her a deadbeat mom. She abandoned her child who was still very young. He was not old enough to take care of himself. And so they tried to, through, and it's building on that culture of gossip. They tried to pressure her through gossip to come back to Rome. And because Roman circles, the gossip about someone who is as rich and famous as Melania, the gossip does not remain in Rome. It goes and travels and follows her. It goes to the Roman nobility living in Alexandria and to other places. So she was, of course, recognized. She was insulted. And even some of the local political leaders who technically would have been already Christian at this time, or at least favorable to Christians, even they participated in trying to pressure her. And so, for example, the governor of Egypt, not knowing what to do with this phenomenon of monastics, because this was something new. You know, Jesus didn't exactly write about this. They didn't quite understand, you know, why people would want to go live in the desert. And by going to the desert, they were attracting other people, especially affluent people, especially like the children of well-to-do families. And with women especially, one of the problems is that many young Christian girls who were ready to be married would disappear and run off to the desert before they would get married. And so there was a lot of pressure on the governor of Egypt to do something about this monastic problem in the desert. And so the governor of Egypt made monasticism in this form. This is still not community life, but rather hermits living in caves with a loose association amongst themselves. So they would gather together, for example, on Sundays to pray, to serve the divine liturgy, to, so they had that structure, that connectedness, but otherwise they were hermits. So the governor illegalizes this, and he sends, and many of the monastics flee to Palestine and Syria. And Palestine and Syria have also, there's the Judean desert in the Holy Land. And then in Syria, there's a big desert right in the middle of the country. And so these areas were also Christianized significantly, had ancient presence of Christians. After all, the Syrian desert is close to the city of Antioch, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. And the Holy Land had many Christians who traced their own faith to the 12 apostles and to Jesus himself. And so Melania follows the monastics to the Holy Land. And in the Holy Land, they get wind. The governor of Palestine gets wind that, these monastics are no good. They're just going to cause problems, and more of the well-to-do are going to be fleeing, or their kids are going to be fleeing to the desert to be monastics. And so the governor of Palestine arrests Melania and imprisons her because they find proof that she, who still has a lot of money, is using her money to help all these monks and nuns who have escaped from Egypt. She is helping them out. She is feeding them. She is getting them the things that they need in order to subsist. And so there is this preserved by Saint Jerome. There is this conversation. She is called before the governor of Palestine. The governor of Palestine is not familiar with her. He doesn't recognize her. She, of course, has been living in the desert, so she's given up all those trappings of power and wealth, and so she no longer looks the part of one of the richest women of the Roman Empire. And she comes before the governor of Palestine, and as he interrogates her about the money that she is using to support monastics, he seems to insinuate that it's stolen money. And so she pulls rank, and she tells him, and it's quoted by Jerome, she says, "I am the daughter of so-and-so. I am the wife of so-and-so, and I belong to these families, but I am Christ's slave." And so that kind of blew him away. He released her very fast because she, knew the right names, and those names had weight even in far-off Palestine. And so she was then at that point released. And so in Palestine, what she does is that she founds two monasteries. She founds a monastery, well, both monasteries are basically in the city of Jerusalem. One is for men and one is for women. It is structured much the same way, so they live as hermits, and the monastery has within itself, it has the church, it has the space for the monastics to gather and to share meals, share time together, have even elections of who would be the leader of the monastery before they retreat back to their monastic caves. And so in her life, she eventually goes back to Rome because she finds out that her granddaughter has expressed the desire to become a monastic. And so she returns back to Rome at the age of 60. And there her family, again, begin all of the work of trying to kind of pull her back into their style of life. Apparently, I would say that they are all, by this point, they are all Christians in some form, but still that Roman heritage and legacy and background, it weighs very heavily. And so she takes her granddaughter, liquidates what is left of her property, and returns back to the Holy Land. Saint Jerome refers to her in his writings as a living saint. And this coming from Jerome, this is a big deal because he does not give compliments very easily. And she lives in the monastery that she founded in Palestine with her granddaughter and dies at the age of 70. And so this is Melania the Elder, a Roman woman who had the full experience of Roman life, Egyptian monasticism, and then finally ended up in the Holy Land. And of course, the governor of Egypt is replaced, and monasticism returns to Egypt, even though I think some of the monasticism remained there because it wasn't easy to go into the desert and find where these monks were living, monks and nuns. And so I'm sure that some remained there. There is a continuous history. Another very interesting woman that is written about, again, by Jerome, one that he meets in the Holy Land. Her name is Arzanene, and very different history. She comes from a Christian family in Persia, and she lived in the 5th century, so right at the end of the 300s into the 400s. And when she was 8 years old, she asked her parents to take her to the Holy Land. She wanted to be a pilgrim. And her parents were affluent, well-to-do, and they didn't take her request very seriously. And so after she had pestered them for a longer period of time, they still told her no. And so Arzanene decides to run away, and she runs away from Persia and goes to the Holy Land. And in the Holy Land, she finds a community of women living as hermitesses, living in the area of Palestine that is known as Gaza. that is the Gaza Strip today. Very unfortunate and sad place right now. And there in Gaza, as a child, she became a part of this loose community of women who supported each other, prayed together, and she helped. She learned. She was, you could say, almost like an apprentice. She learned from these women about monasticism and the monastic life, and they gave her the name Susan. And so, so she is known as Saint Susan. She eventually became called to leadership within the community in Gaza and moved the entire community into the Judean desert. And there were other extenuating factors that unfortunately impacted the community in Gaza that required them to move. And she came to, as they were traveling, the story goes that she went into a cave and prayed in the cave. And the sisters in her community, they waited outside as she had directed them. And all night long, they heard just excruciating screams and cries. And in the morning, they couldn't take it anymore. So they went into the cave and they found her all beaten up, essentially. And so they realized that through the night, she had been assaulted by demons. And so they said, this is a sign that we should not be here. And Susan, Mother Susan, told them, no, this is the place where we must be. And so her monastery, her community was established right there. And it was interesting because in the Holy Land in the 5th century, so there were many monastics, many monks, and already there were communities. There were monasteries in the sense of like what we're familiar with. And some of these monks did not particularly care to have women close by. And so there is a story told of a visit she had from 2 monks who came and they knew of her, and she was already an old woman at this point, living as a hermitess. And they said to each other, let's go mess with that old lady. And so they came to her cave and began to, you could say, verbally assault her and say, you know, that what she is doing is not, this is not for women, that monastics can only be men. And so they were, well, extremely rude to her. And her life story was actually, this episode appears in her life story as preserved by St. John of Ephesus, who was the bishop of Ephesus. And so she tells these men, she tells them off, and basically tells them, I may be a woman by nature, but I'm not a woman in my thoughts. And so he calls her, Bishop John calls her a woman of iron. So all of you who think that the Iron Lady was Margaret Thatcher, there is an earlier one that predates her. And so Susan is this other woman who also finds her way to the desert, but from Persia, from a whole nother part. Now, she is not canonized in the Catholic Church, although she does appear in monastic writings that are preserved in Catholic communities. However, she is a saint within the Syrian Orthodox Church. Then there is another woman who is also just very interesting. And her name is Paula. And Paula is another woman from Marcella's circle. She is a saint in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox churches. She was, again, same background, a wealthy woman who was married and had four daughters and one son. And her husband dies, and at the age of 35, she finds herself alone. However, since she has the heir, which was required, she didn't need to get married again. And so she opted to make a vow of chastity, and she became very close with Saint Jerome. And Jerome, since he did participate in Marcella's group, and he did do what we would call like a Bible study with this group of women gathering on the Aventine Hill in Rome, Jerome became close to Paula, and eventually, though, that closeness became fodder for gossip. And so people close to, I guess, to this group began to say that their relationship was more than just a spiritual brotherhood, sisterhood. And so Paula decides, based on that, to leave Rome. And similarly to Constantine leaving Rome and Melania leaving Rome, she did the same thing. She unloaded everything she had and liquidated all of her assets. And with her daughter, who also was desirous of monasticism, they went to the Holy Land. And eventually Jerome comes to the Holy Land too. And so these two old friends, they reconnect. And as Jerome is pondering what to do, and Jerome does give her this credit, she tells him, well, you know, since you're not doing anything, how about translating the Bible into Latin? And so she is given the credit as being the instigator, the one who planted that idea in Jerome's head. And then her, as well as her daughter, they were the ones who redacted and copied what Jerome translated. And you know, one of the reasons for this, which you know, you would think, well, you know, why would she be doing something like this? Remember that women of a certain class in Roman society were extremely well educated. And so she could read and write and compose. She could do everything just as well, if not better, than any man. Because that was the one thing in Roman society, they did not distinguish in education. When it came to education between men and women of a certain class, they were afforded the exact same education. Of course, you know, some man who would be maybe slated for a military history would be directed a little more specifically. But she definitely was more than qualified, and so was her daughter, who came from that same background. And so she edited his work, Jerome's work, and she made copies by hand of his work. with her daughter, copies of the Vulgate. She died at the age of 56 and was buried next to the Basilica of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And Jerome says that she was very well loved, and her body was carried into the church by bishops who came for her funeral. And her funeral took an entire week because so many of the monastics who were living as hermits and hermitesses in the desert came into the city to pay their respects and to show their care for her. And she died in 404. And so that was Saint Paula. Now there are other women who, I mean, there is a considerable amount of materials out there when it comes to the desert mothers. What is commonly used as an honorific is based on Coptic and also used in Syriac or Aramaic, and so they are called Ammas, A-M-M-A. And fathers are called Abbas. Abba, singular, Abbas, plural in English, not plural in Syriac. So Amma would be like Amma Paula, Amma Melania. That would be the title they're given. And so there are a couple of other very important, especially Egyptian mothers, that I'd just like to mention. These are ones that you can even research. The Coptic Church especially has a lot of materials on these different mothers. And one of these is Amma Syncletica. And she is venerated by all the different churches, Eastern and Western. Her sayings, there is a body of literature that is called the Apophthegmata Patrum, which means sayings of the fathers. And this text is, in every monastic library, because it is not just sayings, it's really the wisdom of these fathers and mothers. And so Syncletica has, in a book that is called Sayings of the Fathers, she actually has 27 sayings that are preserved there. And there are other women who also are a part of that body of literature. Now, Syncletica lived a little earlier. She is in that first generation of Egyptian desert mothers. She was born around the year 270 in the city of Alexandria, and she was wealthy and educated, and she decided to, after the death of her parents, she took her sister, who was blind, and sold everything that she had, and she moved into her family tomb. So in many of these ancient cemeteries, you would have like a mausoleum building, especially for the very well-to-do. And so she literally moved into the mausoleum with the remains of all of her family and her ancestors. And that's where she lived. And, people, of course, they said that she was kind of nuts, as people would. And so she got a lot of criticism for that. A lot of people even verbally attacked her. And so what she did was, her reaction to that was that she shaved her head, and she did everything possible to be as unappealing and unfeminine, because she thought that a part of the reaction that was hostile to her was the fact that she was a woman. And so she was understood or misunderstood as being somehow feeble or weak. And so she took control of that. And this discipline of hers, well, it attracted a lot of other women, a lot of young women and girls. And so within 10 years of being there, she basically created a monastic community that was on the outskirts of Alexandria, that was next to the cemetery. And again, her wisdom, her writings are preserved in some limited way in texts from the fathers, and they're also repeated by monastic communities. There is another woman also from this same period named Theodora of Alexandria, Amma Theodora. And her desire to be a monastic was so deep that she left her family, left her home, and assumed the clothing and garb and haircut of a man so that she could live in the desert with a monastic community. And as you can imagine, that did not go well. She was found out and ended up having to go out on her own. However, she did find other women similarly minded, and her wisdom and her strength of spiritual life was so famous that in her lifetime, many other monastics, including men, and a number of bishops went to her in the desert for spiritual direction. And she also has sayings that are preserved in this Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the fathers. Both Syncletica and Theodora are also preserved. Their life story is preserved in Book 1 of the Vitae Patrum, which is the lives of the fathers. Ironically, again, what's in a title? Obviously not much. This book that's supposed to be the lives of the fathers actually also contains the lives of 12 desert mothers. So you would think that somebody would have corrected that and called it the lives of the fathers and mothers or something, but that's unfortunately how things go. And there is one more woman that I would like to bring up, and she is Sarah of the desert. And her life story is also preserved as one of those 12 in the Vitae Patrum. And she lived for 60 years as a hermitess with no contact with anyone. And, an unbelievably long period. However, her life story was preserved through the monastics who supported her, and through the way that the monastics also preserved the stories of the different heroes, in a sense, of monasticism. She was known to have struggled with desires and passions, and she she challenged a lot of monks. They referred to her as being very manly in her own pursuit of perfection. And so she is another one, Sarah of the desert. And I'd like to share with you there are these sayings that are now available to discover some of these beautiful witnesses of faith. And so I'd like to share with you a couple of the pearls of wisdom. Amma Syncletica said, "In the beginning, there are a great many battles and a good deal of suffering for those who are advancing towards God. And afterwards, there is ineffable joy. It is like those who wish to light a fire. At first, they are choked by the smoke and they cry, and by this means obtain what they seek. As it is said, our God is a consuming fire. So we too must kindle the divine fire in ourselves through tears and hard work." Amma Syncletica also said, "Just as the most bitter medicine drives out poisonous creatures, so prayer joined to fasting drives evil away." And then Amma Theodora said, "It is good to live in peace, for the wise man practices perpetual prayer. It is truly a great thing for a virgin or a monk to live in peace, especially for the younger ones. However, you should realize that as soon as you intend to live in peace, at once evil comes and weighs down your soul through akidia, faint-heartedness, and evil thoughts. It also attacks your body through sickness, debility, weakening of the knees and all the members. It dissipates the strength of soul and body so that one believes one is ill and no longer able to pray. But if we are vigilant, these temptations fall away." And there's a word that was not translated because it's a little difficult to translate it. And this is a very common theme in monastic writings, akidia. Akidia means, the generic translation of the Greek is listlessness. And however, practically, it can be translated as not caring, as indifference, as apathy, as laziness, as boredom. And so now you can see why akidia, and I'm reading this is the English translation, and the translator apparently gave up on that word because it has so many layers and can mean for one person one thing, for another person a different thing. Still related, but nonetheless also nuanced a little differently. And finally, just briefly, Amma Sarah, the third of these Egyptian mothers, said, "It is good to give alms for men's sake, even if it only is done to please men. Through it, one can begin to seek to please God." So I thought that was particularly contemporary, because it's nowadays you get all these different things in the mail or, online, and you go and put in your credit card or fill out a check and, stamp it or press the button and you send a donation. And so it's interesting, her take even on that, which is kind of a not as magnanimous, generous action. It can still please God. There's some wisdom to it. It can be the beginning of a greater generosity and almsgiving. And so, so with this wisdom, which is just a sampling of some of the wisdom of these mothers, these desert mothers, that's where I would like to conclude. I would also like just to kind of historically connect a few dots. In the 4th century, Saint Anthony of Egypt, Anthony the Great, as he is called in the Eastern churches. So he came up with the first rule, and his rule is the one that Saint Benedict used for his rule for monastic life. And so we have his icon here, which is hanging in our church, with preserved on the scroll is one of his writings for his community. I no longer fear God, but I love him. And that's profound also in its own way, because that's part of the journey. Many times the relationship with God is based on fear of God rather than the understanding of God's love. And then at the beginning, I mentioned one of the desert mothers who is held up to all Christians as really the example of conversion, and that would be Saint Mary of Egypt, who we also have in our church, and who crossed the Jordan, which is right there behind her, after, she worked as a prostitute and decided to go to the Holy Land and corrupted men who were on their way to the Holy Land. She went from Alexandria to the Holy Land, and she found a good deal of business, unfortunately. And then when she tried to enter into the Basilica of the Resurrection, she was unable to. There was a force that prevented her from going through the door. And it wasn't until she saw the image of the Mother of God over the door that she had a complete penitent conversion of heart. And she went in and was able to venerate the holy places, and then receive through the Holy Spirit the instruction that she should cross the Jordan River and be in the desert. And so she lived then the rest of her life in the desert, and for many, many decades, for almost 50 years. And her there in the desert, eventually her hair covered her body, and her clothes rotted on her body, and a monk was traveling through and happened upon her, and he heard her confession and her whole life story, which then he wrote down, and he asked her if he could share it with monks. And so it became kind of the manual of conversion, of this extreme conversion. And she's very often, she is mentioned as kind of like, the first of among the mothers, even though she lived a little later. She's already in the 5th century. So there were other mothers in the desert before her. However, her conversion and then her purification in the desert, that is what is kind of the theme of that writing of her life. And the priest Zosimas, who is also a saint, who heard her confession, so he wrote that because of how she had been purified, that she was like looking into light, and that she did not walk on the sand, that she was above the sand. And then that when he went to the holy city, to Jerusalem, and then a year later he went back to his monastery, so he crossed through the desert again and brought her communion. And so she received communion, and then when he returned again through the desert, so he found her body, and she had written a note there in the sand that asking him to bury her body, that she fell asleep in the Lord the day after he gave her communion. And so he became then, of course, the one who preserved her life story. But since her life story was in the context of confession, so he had to get her permission to, as they say, break the seal of confession. But even to that, her reaction was one of, who can glean any bit of worth out of my inadequate and shameful life. And so, but in humility, so she is the best known of these hermitess desert mothers. Now, in the desert mothers, just as a footnote, they are the foundation then also of the communities. So very often, like in Egypt today, if we go to Egypt, we'll find lots of ancient monasteries of nuns and monasteries of monks. And they are literally built on top of the presence of these hermitesses and hermits. Because eventually, for protection of the monastics, it became necessary, especially when you imagine like Islam sweeping through Egypt and Syria and other parts of the Middle East. So living in community also protected the monks in many ways. And so the hermit life became less while community life grew. But if you go like in the Holy Land to the monastery of Saint Saba, which is one of these ancient monasteries from the 5th century, you see this big monastery literally hanging off a cliff. And then when you go into the canyon that is there, it's a rather deep canyon, so you can see along the walls on both sides, there are little paths that you can climb to caves. And the caves they're decorated. They're actually decorated with like crosses outside that were inscribed by hermit monks, from the 3rd, 4th century up until recently, and even up to today. There are still monks that go from Saint Saba's monastery and spend like all of Lent on a retreat, living in a cave. I don't know if I would do that. I'm too attached to my Wi-Fi, and so I might not get away with living in a cave just yet. So it's a good thought. Questions? Unfortunately, they did not. The lives were usually preserved by men, and then they were also preserved within the communities of women. There are some nice new books. The Desert Mothers, and that's a very nice introduction to some of these women. This book, which is by Mike Aquilina, it's a Catholic book. He's a well-known Catholic author. It's called The Witness of Early Christian Women. And so it gives some information. And there are more books. There are definitely more books out there. I would urge you, if you look up some of these books, look up the authors, because that's one of the unfortunate things, that some of the books that are out there come out of a perspective of like feminist theology, and so they manipulate a little bit some of the areas that might be controversial, because there are things like, of course, deaconesses in communities of these early nuns living as hermitesses, or even in communities, deaconesses were present And because the monastic priests would come and celebrate liturgy, and they would consecrate communion and leave it reserved. And then the nuns would have a deaconess or two or three that would then lead prayers with the community, distribute communion when a priest wasn't there. It was considered to be safer in a sense, to not have a man living in close proximity to the community. And so that was, I guess we would say a prudent decision by these communities. And so some of the authors who come out of that perspective of feminist theology try to generate a little bit more controversy around this when it's not that big of a deal. And deaconesses, although they were not a part of the Roman Catholic tradition, they are found in all of the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches. However, today, the role of deaconesses is for most historical or exclusively tied to monasteries. So like Eastern Catholic churches do not have deaconesses. Greek Orthodox Church has a number of deaconesses who serve only in monasteries. And then the Coptic Orthodox Church, so they now have a couple of deaconesses. They have the ones that are in monasteries, and then they have two deaconesses who actually work as directors of religious education, believe it or not. And that's kind of a new thing because they are lay women in that sense who have been ordained. And so they're secular clergy, but not monastic. But, so this, on the East, this has been continuing. In the East, this has been done in some form, not as much as earlier, but in some form. And so sometimes it's kind of hijacked and used to stir up a little bit of controversy. In the sisterhood, the ones who made what we would call like final vows, perpetual vows, so they all received the title of mother, given as a sign of perpetual profession, that this was the one who had attained a certain level of spiritual growth and living. And so that was recognized by motherhood, and that also meant that she could give spiritual direction. She could lead a community. And there are also mothers who come from more humble backgrounds. But I think the place of the wealthier women, it's more interesting. Perhaps this is the human element. So you have someone who gives up everything. Yeah. I think one of the reasons there is a fascination with St. Francis, for example. Very difficult to, imagine doing something like that. And in many ways, they have a harder journey than the men who came from rich backgrounds. They literally had to fight society, family, to first hang on to their wealth so that they could use it for what they wanted, and to pursue a religious monastic life. That was something that was not easy to just decide and go. Aramaic, but it is also used in Coptic.